Well, hello, everybody. Happy Friday the 13th slash Valentine's Day Eve, however you want to look at it. I am glad to have you regardless. I am going to share my screen here and we're going to get right into it. We have a ton of content to cover today, so I'm super grateful you made the time. Our topic is what product leaders need to know about agentic AI. So hopefully you'll recognize this as an area where we all need to do a bit of learning. And so I'm really glad that I could, make some space to provide that for you. This presentation came out of one, of course, my interest in AI, but two, I was recently on a podcast about agentic AI, and we talked a lot about governance, but we didn't talk about really the product decisions that go into strategically thinking about deploying and designing agentic AI. And I think there's a lot to unpack here. So I thought, you know what, we've got to talk about it. We've got to share it. So that's what we're going to do. I am going to say a couple words about who I am and what my perspective is on this topic, because I think it's going to help inform you as to, what I can speak to, what I can't speak to, and just kind of level set a little bit. But my name is Jill Hines, for those of you who don't know me. I have been doing market, competitive product, user research for 20 years. It's been most of my career. I have been in product leadership roles, both in higher ed and in digital product agencies for more than 10. I love building stuff with teams. It's been so fun. When ChatGPT came out, like a lot of you, it was really an eye-opening moment for me. And I took on the role in my previous agency to be one of the co-leads of the data and AI team. And I also led the formation of our first AI governance function. So that really gave me the itch for understanding organizational and business strategy and marrying that with our tech strategy. So currently, I am the founder and senior AI strategy advisor for my own consultancy, Saddle Stitch Consulting. I also serve as the responsible AI program director for the American College of Financial Services Center for Ethics in Financial Services, which I'm super privileged to be able to do. So as I said, I left the digital agency life 6 months ago to lean into Saddle Stitch and orient it around AI, because I just see a big need for organizations to step back from the hype and this rush to deploy AI. And I know that you know what I'm talking about out there, to really learn the technology's advantages, its drawbacks, and just reground them in what's really going to help and not hurt our stakeholders. There's a lot of new things with generative AI, but many more old things in terms of how we think about product and think about our users and product market fit, and all of that still holds true. But I'm talking specifically about agentic AI today because I think it's a prime example where we as product leaders have a tremendous opportunity to lead our organizations toward responsible, worthwhile implementations. But this risk profile is significantly different enough that we need to cut through that hype and break down all of the many strategic decisions that we need to contend with and become that voice of credibility within our organizations. So I hope you're on board for that. Specifically, what we are going to cover is we're going to touch on a little bit about what the news says and what's really going on, because I think it shapes our impressions of what's going on in the agentic AI space. And as we will see, if you double click beyond those headlines, it's not all that it seems. So I want to marry that up with some, facts from industry reports. I want to talk a little bit about what is special about agentic AI versus traditional software or machine learning. Some things they share in common, some things are meaningfully different. I want you to understand the differences. I'm going to walk you through a case study as well. This was one, I think it was an awesome case study done at Atlassian, and they were exploring using agents with humans in the loop, and we're going to talk about what we can learn from that as an example. I'm also going to help, I hope, prepare you for key questions that you can ask as product leaders, because you're in a prime position to do that in this Gen AI era. But I am going to say, let's be a bit humble. I cannot emphasize truly how early we are in the generative AI, whatever it will become. Let's just say this era, this phase. We are at the crawl stages. Everyone who deeply knows this technology knows that we are just at the very, very beginning. So while we are still trying to figure out how to crawl, there's tremendous pressure to just take off and run. And I recognize that. That's a hard place to be in for many of us. It's exciting, it's challenging, it's all the things, but it is a reality. So I want to lead by example here. As I said, I am a researcher, I'm a product strategist. I am not a data scientist or an engineer, though I've worked side by side with them for many years. I am learning a lot as well as you. So if you have a question I can't answer during this session today, I will do my best to find an answer, find someone who I can connect you with. We can chat about it later. But please go ahead and feel free to use that comment chat function in LinkedIn to offer your own insights and resources and to help others, because, you know, we gotta be in this together. I'm going to try to leave a little time at the end for Q&A. We have a really packed set of slides and content to get through, but feel free to add questions as you think of them in the chat. Maybe someone will answer them, and as I say, I'll try to go through them at the end. This presentation is being streamed, so it's streaming through LinkedIn, and I always get the question, well, where is the recording going to go? LinkedIn is going to automatically make that available in the original post about the event, so you can always go back and watch it there. I also post my content to YouTube, and I will make the slides available on my website over the weekend. I'm going to add some references to the slides before I post it. Also, if we have a conversation today that tells me I need to edit or add some things, I'll do that. So I think that sets the table, and we can go ahead and get into the meat of it here. Let's start just by talking about a very teeny tiny sliver of what's happening in the news. This is just a smattering of things that I've seen in the past week or so come through my feed, which I'm always, kind of monitoring for AI news. We'll just start at the beginning. Google announced a universal commerce protocol. I think they announced this back in, I want to say, January, but the more recent news is about the fact that folks who are using Google AI mode or Gemini can use that protocol within that interface to make purchases with Etsy or Wayfair. The promise laid out in this article is that over time, this UCP, this Universal Commerce Protocol, will allow agents to discover inventory, negotiate options, and execute payments without the customer ever having to leave the conversation. That is not reality yet. That is the potential. 𝗵𝘂𝗺 and Moltbook. How many of you have not heard of 𝗵𝘂𝗺 and Moltbook at this point? They're even hard to say, Moltbook. It's been a really big deal in the tech community. I think it has been a fun experiment. Essentially what 𝗵𝘂𝗺 is, and it's gone by different names. I think it's at 𝗵𝘂𝗺 right now. It was 𝘂𝗵𝗆bot, which is too close to Claude AI, and then it's Moltbot. Regardless of what you call it, it's basically a framework that allows people to easily create AI agents and give them access to just about anything they want on their computer. Email, payment methods, you name it. As you might imagine, it has raised a lot of concern about security and safety issues. There are lots and lots of holes in it, so don't use this unless you really, really know what you're doing. And a lot of folks are, kind of deploying it on their own separate computers and all that kind of stuff. It's very experimental. Moltbook is the kind of Facebook for these agents to be deployed and kind of talk amongst themselves. And there's a lot more to say about all of that, but it has gotten a lot of hype, but it is not any kind of production thing. It's not a new technology that's being deployed. It's agents and people kind of just doing experimental things, but very interesting. Agentic AI in healthcare marketing is another article that I saw. And, what's interesting here, this is another headline that makes you think, oh, agentic AI is coming to healthcare. And people are thinking about it. But in the meat of the article, you see that there's more kind of speculation about future potential. In this case, there's speculation about how pharmaceutical sales reps can reach out to healthcare practitioners. And the idea is that one day an AI agent would create a custom call plan for each healthcare representative or healthcare practitioner based on their profile that they've aggregated. It would recommend follow-up steps. It would, perhaps engage in some outreach, all with, out a whole lot of human intervention. That's not happening today. That's the idea, but you can see the interest. And then finally, the piece from MIT Technology Review is interesting in that, I think in response to the 𝗂𝗵𝗿𝗄 and Moltbook news, they're talking about, can AI agents ever really be secure? And what I will say on this point, and a lot of the article focuses on specifically the risk of prompt injection, is that this is an unsolved problem. This is a real, depending on who you are, you might describe it as an intractable problem, but it is a problem specific to LLMs, specifically because they cannot tell the difference between, say, a malicious instruction, like your agent goes and reads an email that has an instruction that says something like, share, all of your sent mail to this address, or whatever the case. That problem isn't solved because the LLM cannot tell the difference between a command like that and just content and other instructions. So it's unsolved, and people are working around the edges and how you constrain these systems and so forth. But I think that's important to know. So when you step back and look at all this news, you see a lot of, I'm going to say, hype. You see a lot of aspirations for the future and some steps in that direction, but still a lot of unknowns. And it can be very confusing because we're sitting back like, what is really, going on here? What's true? What's speculation? So I want to kind of help break that down with some data from these sources. So, all right. So what is going on? We know, I think, with relatively good certainty that there are some data points that seem to be corroborated amongst kind of the large consultancies doing research in this space. As we saw in the news and we're seeing in the data, the aspirations are very high for agentic AI. We are seeing Deloitte, based on its survey of leaders in organizations over the world, that today 23% of folks are using agentic AI at least moderately in their organizations, and you can read the report to see how they define that. And that number is expected to grow to 74% in the next 2 years. That's based on expectations, nothing necessarily more than that, but you can see how that aspiration does exist. This aligns with the PwC data. There's also a link to that report in here as well, where those aspirations are quite high. And that study focused on American, US companies specifically. So combining a little bit of apples and oranges, but they're kind of pointing directionally in the same place. The other point here, in addition to the aspirations increasing, the budget allocations appear to be rising. So PwC says 88% of executives plan to increase their AI-related budgets. This was published in spring of 2025. So there's, seemingly interest in at least, piloting and experimenting. But on that point, I want to call out that I would warn you against being too swayed by some of the rosy predictions. There is a lot of rubber sort of meeting the road that we are contending with. And so it's not this kind of straight line to the right kind of view when it comes to agentic AI adoption, but it is expected to grow. Currently, and this is per Capgemini, we have 2% of companies reporting implementing AI agents at scale, and another 12% having implemented at partial scale. Again, you can dig into those definitions, but all this to say there's the hype and then the reality. Smaller numbers growing. I would also, have you think about, particularly in your own use case, in your own organization, if you're feeling kind of the pressure to keep up, let's recognize that this adoption isn't necessarily even across the board. We have higher adoption rates within tech, media, telecom, and health, and for functional areas like customer service, support, sales, and marketing. So, folks in manufacturing are a little bit slower to, adopt, and it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of solution for people. The other thing that's really important, as we are moving forward quickly with the technology, we are lagging behind in the governance of that technology. Deloitte says that, while these aspirations are, 2 years, we'll have 74% using AI, agentic AI, at least moderately. 21%, only 21% of companies have a mature model for autonomous agent governance. I sit in enough spaces with folks who are risk managers and who are in the legal and privacy spaces, and this is hugely problematic. Governance is being rethought of in light of generative AI and agentic AI, and the risk surfaces and just profile is not something that current governance is really well equipped to handle. So we're going to see that evolve, but it's important to know it's a bit of a drag on this progress forward. Additionally, in terms of drags, this low trust is weighing down innovation a bit. Most highly trusted uses of agentic AI currently are to analyze data and generate insights. The least trusted activities are to conduct financial transactions, which makes sense. Risk goes up, trust gets a little more, or I should say the risk of financial harms and some of these more concrete harms, as those go up, the trust can be a little shaky because the technology, as we said, is very new. All right. So what does this all mean? I said this isn't a straight line up and to the right story. We have these competing forces. We have the push to move forward. We've got more tools. We have accelerated experimentation. There's kind of this pressure to adopt and deploy. The budgets are, coming into place. There's some competitive pressures, it's hype, and there are legitimately new opportunities and use cases for agentic AI that are all very compelling. What's also true is that there's a pull on this, progress forward. There is uneven adoption. There is uneven training. A lot of people are still coming to terms with what are LLMs, how to properly use a chatbot, let alone some of these other concerns when you get to agentic systems. Security and governance gaps we've touched on. The ROI is still being figured out. It's still unproven. The market fit, still unproven. And the trust can be a bit shaky. So what this all sort of boils down to for product leaders is that we have a new opportunity. And I think that we can be a force for reconciling these tensions and making a really huge impact positively on our organizations. I think specifically if we focus on 4 things, which I'm going to touch on all of these in the remainder of the presentation, I think we'll be well positioned to be helpful. One is that we need to learn the tech. Not a data scientist, but we can learn enough to be more conversant and ask good questions. We can leverage the risks, which sounds a little bit weird. What do you mean leverage a risk? Don't we want to avoid risk? Yes, we do. But I think knowing the risk profile is a point of leverage for us in that we can then use that as design inspiration, as useful constraints, and as points of conversation to help guide our organization strategically. And then knowing the unknowns. This is kind of where humility has to come into play, because we have to remind ourselves we are in a newer space, and it is okay to not know things, but that means also maybe let's not, scale, super, super quickly until we kind of walk before we run, if that makes sense. And then finally, being the bridge. I'll talk more about what that means, but product leaders usually sit in this really interesting space between the business and delivery. And I think within that, we have tremendous potential to shape a lot of these gaps or these drags on the system in a way that respects the users, that builds trust, and does all those good things. So more to come on that. All right, I'm going to take a sip of water here. And then we're going to talk about the flavors of agentic AI. There are a couple of distinctions to make that I think are important for you as product leaders to recognize in your conversations with your technology folks and leadership. But the first form of agentic systems I want to talk about is agentic workflows. So an AI workflow example, in this case, is just a very, very, very simplified version of a workflow that is designed to clean up a meeting transcript. So step 1 in cleaning up the transcript, it might be that the user is prompting the system to say, hey, I have this thing, I need to be cleaned. Maybe that document is pre-processed, it's cleaned up. Maybe the ums are taken out of the transcript, that kind of thing. Then we might add an LLM here to summarize and classify the information in a particular way. Then, oops, that should be step 4. We're going to post-process that document. We're going to format it properly. And then finally, we are going to deliver the output. So this example of a workflow does include an AI component. It includes a large language model, but it's not driven by that model. That model is one component of it. These steps in the workflow are predefined. So we know there's always going to be a query, a pre-process step, an LLM call, a post-processing step, and a delivery step. Like that has been predetermined. And it is deterministic in that we know what the flow is going to be. It's the piece of non-determinism that is the thing that we don't know exactly what the outputs are going to be resides in that LLM step. And that's why you should think about that and where you plug that in, because it adds that little bit of uncertainty, which can actually be a great thing, but it can also be inappropriate in certain contexts. Yeah, no loops, no dynamic branching. Is just kind of a straight workflow. So the other flavor of agency, and I think this is the one that gets more of the buzz, and I for good reason. I think when I think of the benefits or the future potential of AI, it's more along the lines of an AI agent that's actually doing things on my behalf and, making it easy, kind of that Star Trek vision of the future kind of thing. But the way that this works is meaningfully different. And I just want to talk through this example. We're going to imagine that we have tasked our system to research a topic and write a report about it. So perhaps the kickoff to this flow is for the we're setting a user goal here. And what's important to note is that unlike in the previous example, we're setting a goal, but we are not prescribing the steps. You do not see 1, 2, 3, 4, marched throughout here. In fact, it is up to the LLM to reason and plan what to do. So given this user goal, how am I going to solve it with the tools that I have at my disposal? So that also it entails providing it access to tools. It could be, a website that it can consult. It could be some databases. Maybe a calculator is important for this use case, but you provision those tools and that access. It determines what tools are needed, if any. And then you have a step where the LLM is going to reassess the output, like, oh, is this actually meeting the goal that was specified? Let me check. No, I think I need more information from, say, the web. I'm going to go back out, and it's going to complete that until it believes it has met the goal. So this is very different in that, as I said, the LLM is making the plans, deciding what to do. And just remember, large language models have that element of non-determinism. So it's going to be wrong sometimes in interpreting the goal. It's just a thing. It has access to these tools and it can call them dynamically. It's going to kind of loop around until the goal is met. And as I said, it's a non-deterministic flow. It's not a step-by-step. So if you want more details on that, I have links in the slides. You can look up what is called the React pattern. It's sort of conceptual framework for how these agents work. And it's basically they reason through kind of step by step what they're doing, then they complete an action. So you might want to become familiar with that. And Amazon has a pretty good discussion on what are AI agents. There's tons of resources out there. And I'll add more to the appendix as well. So hopefully between these two things, you can see that there's a meaningful difference in these architectures and in this technology in general. At the end of the day, for scenario number 2, we are granting more autonomy to a non-deterministic system. So this is much more open-ended. It has more agency. And the question for us, we have a number of questions as product folks, is when is this useful and appropriate? I think we need to help guide that decision where it's not, number 2 is not appropriate for a lot of cases. In fact, number 1 suits many use cases very well. So by understanding why that's the case and how these systems work, we can be better prepared to be in that conversation. We should also think about how much agency the tool must have to complete a goal and manage to the least amount. A lot of these AI agents get into problems where they are given either too many tools, too much agency, or too much access. And so that first and foremost has to be really thought through in the earliest planning stages. And then, what tools are needed, favor zero trust architecture. There's a link if you want to discuss that, but basically don't trust them. Just as you would. I mean, people use the analogy, I think it's helpful, of imagine that these are like, new hires in your organizations, new interns, whatever. You're not going to give them, access to everything. Yes, that's the distinction there. All right. So I said that there are, risks, and these have different risk profiles. And I do want to touch on that a bit. I am kind of a nerd when it comes to risks. I'm not going to lie. I love thinking about risk because it is usually such a fruitful jumping off point to ideate solutions. And so I find it fun. I am an anomaly in that way. I get it. But one of the ways that I have found it helpful for me to think about AI agent risks is that we, essentially what we are doing is we are aggregating a bunch of discrete risks together from 3 different kind of profiles. And then, when we agentify something and give it agency to run, or we scale these things, we could be amplifying them. So by being an expert in sort of these risk profiles, you can make really informed decisions about when and what to use, how to design them in anticipation of those risks. And this is where I argue there is a huge gap right now. We're in the crawling phases, and I don't think people are thinking enough about the risk profiles in detail, and you can be that person. So what I would say, I'm not going to read through all of these risks, but I will just say, first of all, when you automate anything, that carries with it a few risks, right? People could be over-reliant on the automation. This automation bias comes into play, and we've seen that. That's a very known problem. Data privacy violations could become more prevalent. You can be amplifying things, harms as you automate them. There could be environmental impacts because of the system requirements for these things. Maybe customer dissatisfaction is an outcome that you want to avoid. Maybe people don't want things to be automated. We actually see that too in doing user research, that some steps that feel overly manual are manual for reasons, because people need that human contact, and it's just a factor. Skill atrophy as we offload things to computers. LLMs have their own risk profiles. We know they hallucinate. We know they're non-deterministic, which is also a plus of the technology and a con. They're susceptible to model drift and data poisoning and these kinds of things. And then the AI agents can misinterpret your goals. They can misuse tools. They can have these runaway feedback loops. They, can execute code unexpectedly. We've seen these risks materialize in trials, not in huge, large scale ways, but they are possible. So you can refer to these resources here for a risk. But what I want to leave you with about risk on a positive note is that if you understand them well enough, this can become a huge source of inspiration for you in selecting your design decisions. So when you think about automation, determine as a product leader, we can help our organizations determine when is it useful and when is it actually hindering our goals. And by the way, let's help define goals. We know that's the hardest part of any kind of product endeavor. We can get user input. We can use real world data to inform that. We can make sure we're really understanding the flows we're automating, et cetera, et cetera. So for every risk, there is a potential mitigation that may be suitable for the use case, but you as the product leader are the expert in making that determination. And then regardless of which technology we're deploying, we have a great amount of influence over truing the outputs back to those original goals, to the user needs, making sure the metrics are in alignment with those goals, and that we're monitoring for any unanticipated behavior or harms. We can be masters of that use case and continue to feed changes that we see in the deployments or in our environment back to our governance and tech teams. So there's a huge opportunity in kind of with a risk mitigation frame that I happen to find pretty compelling. I do want to speak about one potential risk mitigation that I hear a lot about, but I feel very dissatisfied with the way in which it's covered generally. And that could be a fault of me just not having seen maybe more, folks who have gone into more detail. It just escapes me. But one of the things that I see when we talk about agents is that a risk will be uncovered or discussed, and then there will be a statement usually following that to say, well, one way to mitigate that risk is to put a human in the loop. Boom. Okay. Oh, so the human's just going to check to make sure it's okay. Phew. Now I don't have to, worry about that risk. I think that's oversimplified, and that's why I'm dissatisfied with that answer. It doesn't feel like a magic fix-all to me. It feels like another one of those things we're kind of hand waving against, and that I think product leaders can, again, kind of double click and say, whoa, let's actually design this experience. First, let me explain a little bit about what human in the loop is. So this diagram comes from Deloitte. The gray circle on the left here is an example of if you have let's say a small agentic deployment, maybe you're piloting something, and throughout the flow, you're interjecting a human being at certain points just to check, is this really aligned with the goal, or is this really accurate? And then, and before I pay for this thing, is this actually legit? And, the human would approve, and be in that loop in order for it to continue. Deloitte points out that human on the loop is something that may be of greater concern or interest as agents become, multiply within an organization, as they scale agents, and then they orchestrate with one another. So you have agents talking to agents, and that human may not be in every loop, but maybe it's overseeing the orchestration. So it's therefore on the loop. So they're more supervising tasks. But the question that I ask is, who is designing for those human beings? Does the human who is saying yay or nay to these outputs understand the system goals and the expected behavior? Do they know how to report issues given the governance structure? This is a governance decision. What happens if they find something that's going sideways? Do they know what to do? Do they have the appropriate information to make a decision? And from a design point of view, is that information presented in a way that they can comprehend and that's meaningful to them? Do they understand what's the overall risk tolerance from the organization? Also, ideally, something that would come out in governance, but it is something that I think merits some training and socialization. And do they have input at the appropriate places? That's kind of more of an architecture consideration, but it is one I don't think people are asking enough of, and I wish that they would. So, all right, enough about risks. I am going to move on to a case study. And I will just preface it by saying I love this case study. This was one that was done at Atlassian. They basically had, and I'll explain how the study was set up, but I think it's an illustrative example of many of the things that we talked about in terms of what they got right, and where if maybe a product perspective were applied, we would see different and maybe even better results. So let's discuss this. The case study is a tool, an agentic AI tool called 𝗂𝗏. It's a human in the loop software development agents. It's an acronym for something. You can go look it up. The link is here. I'm just going to call the thing 𝗂𝗏. And the problem that the folks at Atlassian were trying to solve for was that, we've got a lot of like mundane kind of code work that could be perhaps handled by an agent. How well would it perform? And the goal would be to build an agent that works with the engineers. So the engineers would be deployed, throughout as humans in the loop in approving code changes. And this involved 22,000 eligible JIRA issues, 2,600 plus practitioners, a sample of which were surveyed at the end to get also their qualitative assessment of how this went. And the idea would be that you integrate this into their daily workflow. You give them maybe a JIRA ticket and a code base. The agent would come up with a plan. The engineer would say, yeah, this plan looks pretty good. Go ahead and do it. It would review the code. And then ultimately, hopefully, that turns into a pull request that gets merged into the code base. So that's the idea of it. They had tested this using some benchmarks internally. They had a benchmark data set, SWE Bench, I think it was the name of it, that they they used to do this preliminary testing. And then they wanted to see, okay, if we deployed this for real with our engineers, what would that look like? So I think it's a really cool way to approach this question. Let's see. Then how it worked. So I touched on this a little bit, but the AI planner agent would read the ticket, identify the files, and develop this plan. The human engineer edits it or rejects it before anything gets coded. And then if all looks good, the AI coding agent executes the plan and kind of refines itself and does its code checks. And then the engineer reviews the generated code, and then it could raise a pull request for team review. So then the key findings. So what did they find out? So it's pretty good, right? 82% of AI coding plans were approved by the engineers. 59% of the pull requests were successfully merged, and 61% of the engineers said the generated code was easy to read and modify. Now, there were many more results, and you can dig into it yourself, but I think it's pretty cool. But again, double clicking is always worth doing, right? To make sure we kind of fully understand. So this is a lot to read, but on the left, you see the workflow, the agentic flow here, from setting up a task to planning to coding and to raising that pull request. You can see that there's a human, involved in each of those phases. But I started a couple of things that I'm going to come back to. But one of the things before I do that, I want to draw your attention to is the diagram on the right-hand side. We talked about the fact that 59% of the issues were actually merged back into the code base. That's of those issues or of that code that actually made it all the way through. So there was a drop-off here. There were some plans that were rejected, didn't pass muster, and didn't make it all the way. So if you look from start to end, 8% of all the HULA issues were actually merged. So it's different. It's a different story, different lens on the 59%. And I'm not saying that that's bad. I'm just saying that's a fact. The reason I started the places in the workflow where I did is that I think there are a couple of things that the study revealed that would be very interesting for product people to take with them. One, that benchmark data, I said they tested it earlier on this data set, SWE bench, was based on JIRA issues that were very detailed and very clean. What the study found was that isn't how people work in everyday life. Go figure. They're in an agile environment. They're chit-chatting with other folks on the team. They might be putting in user stories in those tickets. They're supposed to be placeholders for conversation, right? They're not necessarily supposed to be meticulously documented, or at least that's not how it usually works in practice. And so the benchmark data was skewed toward this less than realistic way in which people work. Also, the way in which you would evaluate success wasn't necessarily totally clear-cut. In the case of engineering, it wasn't sufficient to just say, oh, this passed, some automated testing. It was too expensive to set up, that kind of automated testing for every little thing. And it just came down to there were other qualitative factors in what made good code that were still kind of open-ended questions at the end. So just because it passes kind of like a unit test, it doesn't necessarily mean that was a successful test for reasons. And you can read more about that. So my question to you, product people, is this 8% of all HULA issues merging a good result? I don't know. It very well could be. You'd have to kind of do that ROI calculation about how much time and effort goes into getting that 8% and so on. But I have the question, remember, I'm a researcher, so I ask, could this rate be better if user research had been conducted, or maybe for round two? Like if we understood the workflow that is real and true to how people behave, might we have designed it a little bit differently? Might we have different expectations of success? I raise this because, as a researcher, and you all well know, sometimes it's hard to advocate for doing that kind of upfront field research, but it saves so much time and rework ultimately. And I think you get so many more nuanced insights, which is where your competitive differentiation comes from, and also, your product success ideally. So this is a question I leave with you. There's lots of ways to think about ROI. I did not go into a lot of detail in this presentation as to, how to think about KPIs and so forth with agentic systems, but that information certainly exists. I would just caution, like anything else, ROI is goal and use case dependent. It is not necessarily cut and dry. As we saw here, there are nuances in how we determine and define what successful code is, for example. So, but it's cost you'll want to think about. Token and API use. So these systems are constantly, hitting LLMs, hitting APIs for different tools. If they get stuck in loops, that could ring up a hefty bill if there's not guardrails put in place for that. There's also processing time, memory use, infrastructure, the setup costs. But on the, and the KPIs, the things you would want to monitor commonly, they are things like the success rate, precision, recall, generalization, like can we use this for other problems, time to value, revenue growth, user satisfaction. I'll also point out that there are soft metrics, I suppose, if you will, KPIs, that are very meaningful, that could go either way. Does trust become eroded or supported through the system? We talked about those human skills. We are automating things. Is it worth the trade-off of losing maybe some sharpness of skill by automating this particular task? What does it do to our reputation? Are we one who is known as more of a high-touch, personalized, kind of service offering, or not? A lot of that goes back to your underlying value proposition. So this isn't meant to be prescriptive, but I want you to think not only about the hard costs, but also some of these soft costs, because they are real. We've seen how in that push-pull diagram, they have meaningful impact on our outcomes. Okay, so I think this is, I said this at the beginning, I still think it's true. As typical for a product leader, we are in a really cool position between business leadership and technical delivery. We are the ones who are often collecting the user and market data and reconciling that with our product and our business goals. And this gives us this exceptional vantage point. On the one hand, our executives, and maybe you are one of them, but from what they can glean from a product person is that, they need continuous insight into emerging risks as well as opportunities. So while, we are in this crawl stage, it as well as I do. You look at the news and every single day there is a new development, there is a new impact, there's a new something to consider. And it is so fluid that they really need that continuous insight. And so we are positioned to help kind of be part of that flow of information. And it also kind of in the reverse direction, if you think about it, executive leadership is relying on product to carry through its governance and values. In our governance conversations, we're essentially, in addition to preventing harms, we're really thinking about what is our specific risk tolerance. It's not going to be the same for every industry or every company. And a lot of times those risks, they could be very concrete, like we have regulatory compliance requirements, but other times it's a matter of this is not how we want to be known, or we do want to be known for these things. We have values as an organization, and leadership, is responsible for setting those kind of listening to, accommodating, and then articulating those values and the accountabilities for sustaining them throughout the sort of chain of production. So when we get down to the code level and the MLOps level, are we actually building in the means to monitor, to continuously update and feed information? Product people can help be that bridge. Now, the frontline staff also have needs, right? They need internal and external context to align the technology. It is so tempting to get into, your zone. And that's what, in developers and engineers, like their job is to figure out these technical problems. So when I've worked with those teams in doing some risk mitigation, pre-mortems and things like that, it's no fault of theirs, but it is very true that they are very focused on the technical challenges of the problem and sort of the other considerations about how this might impact, users, or what about this particular case that's important to our stakeholders. Some of that just kind of falls by the wayside. So we need to reintroduce that to the team and keep that context at the forefront, And I will also say in a generative AI paradigm where context is pretty much everything. If you don't understand the context, these systems just aren't going to work. Being able to build in the nuances that we see is differentiating. Again, we talked about carrying through governance, knowing their accountability. So we don't want to put our frontline teams in the position of, hey, I'm the human in the loop, or I'm just, I'm doing my job. I have a concern or I see something in this wildly fluid environment, and I don't know how to escalate. I don't know if it's my job to do something or not. Those areas of ambiguity need to be funneled to the right place so that they can become resolved. And also people need to be educated about the paths that do exist so that they can use them properly and not own all of that kind of responsibility. That's not appropriate. So they need a path to executives. So again, product leaders, can ensure that agentic AI relates back to the ground truth. This is the real users, real workflows, these real market needs. I like to put it as like, is your AI touching grass? That's really what I do in a lot of my business, is just making sure we are truing back, because so much of technology is abstraction on top of abstraction on top of abstraction. And then it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Wait, do we even really know what users think about this or how it's working in the field? The 𝗂𝗏 example is great. Like we saw super cool experiment, super cool idea, a little bit of a disconnect with real workflows, and we can fix that. So anyway, I said my piece there, but hopefully that is clear. So that really concludes what I have to say. I just want to make it known that I am available to talk to you at any time. I do offer free 30-minute consultations. I work in the strategic AI intelligence research, road mapping, and governance space, and you can find me on all the socials. I'm pretty much on all of them. So that is it for me. Just as a reminder, this live stream will be captured in LinkedIn pretty much instantaneously. Over the weekend, I will post this to YouTube, and I will get the slides out on my website, and I will notify you when I do that. So I am going to now take these slides off the screen. I am going to see if there were any comments that have come in, or check to see if anyone has any comments now that we've kind of gone through the content. So last chance for questions. I want to thank the folks who have joined. And Salim, I see that you have said, I am inclined to building agentic AI solutions. So yeah, you're in the right spot. Hopefully this was enlightening and offered you a different perspective or two that you can take away. All right. Well, I'm going to leave it there then, since I don't see any other comments coming in. I think you know how to find me. I am delighted to have had this opportunity, and I hope to catch you at another session. Thank you so much.